Okay, so we'll pick up with where we left off in invertebrates and hopefully sort of start to round this all out. All right, I just want to make sure this is actually, yes, doing its thing. It was blinking. Okay, so we left off, our last phylum we talked about were the mollusks, right? And so as we leave mollusks behind and move forward to our next group, we're going to start to see organisms that have, to some extent or another, some degree of segmentation. And so when we were looking at hydrostatic skeletons, I meant to go get one of my little water wigglers again. When we were talking about hydrostatic skeletons, one of the things that made movement really different for segmented organisms versus non-segmented organisms was that they could control those segments independently, right? So when we move into segments, we have increased locomotion and flexibility. So we can flex around the segments, we can control the segmented units somewhat independently from each other, and we can move those units in a group, and so we can have more directed controlled movement. So when we move up to segmentation, it changes how organisms move through space, how they can locomote. It also gives some built-in redundancy. So we were just looking at the water balance system of the earthworm, right? Each segment has its own system. If one of those segments is damaged or perforated, neighboring segments can still do their jobs, right? And so you can essentially have a segment that might be not functioning fully, but we can still get most of the tasks done by all of the neighboring segments. And so that built-in redundancy gives us some flexibility with recovering from injury and damage. It also allows for more sophisticated nervous system, because if each segment has independent innervation and control, then we can start to communicate on a finer scale, increase sensory perception, those kinds of things. So segments have a next step evolutionarily in terms of how they can perceive and interact with the world. So our next group of organisms are the segmented worms. And so this phylum is known as Annelida. Anna like annual or annus, ring, cycle. And so that word ring, these are the ringworms, the segmented worms. Not the same as what you think of as ringworm if you're somebody who's dealt with that, but segmented worms. Most of these things are the same as our previous group: well-developed organ systems, bilateral symmetry, coelomate body cavity, cephalization, complete digestive tract with 2 openings. We add segmentation, and our segmented worms also have a closed circulatory system. So they don't have a hemocoel or an open space where blood is pooling. They have a completely closed circulatory system with arteries, veins, capillaries, and all of those repetitive organs, like we were looking at with kidney-like organs, are then encapsulated by capillaries and interact with the circulatory system. Most of the nodding coming from people who are like, I'm not writing it. Move on. Okay. So if we look just at earthworms and blackworms, they're in a group known as Oligochaeta, the oligochaetes. And the giant Australian earthworm there is an impressive specimen. They can get quite large in size. We have some pretty giant, fast moving ones in our forest. Like, go out in the GCC forest after a good rain, the things are nice and wet, and like the earth is moving underneath you, and it's these giant segmented worms. Earthworms are actually not native to New England. The earthworms that we have here all came in as contaminants of soil and food products brought by Europeans. They completely alter the decomposition cycle from a fungus-based cycle to an animal-based cycle, and change how the forest works. But they're here. There's no hope of ever getting rid of them. They're part of our system, but they're not native. So this image here is showing you the basic organ systems of earthworms. If any of you are old enough that you did segments in your, or did dissections in your biology classes growing up, they're one of the invertebrates that are used really commonly for that, because they have very clear organ systems that are recognizable and analogous to our mammalian systems. So if we look, this is the mouth end, this is the tail end. We have a concentration of neural ganglia in a brain. We have 2 dorsal nerve cords that go down each, run the full length of the body on each side. We have the pumping hearts with the dorsal vessel and the ventral vessel. We have excretory organs in every single segment. I said that we have repeating segments, right? And each unit is its own separate space. We've got sort of an independent coelom space for each segment. The digestive tract, however, is continuous. So if you look at the segments of an earthworm's body, each ring or segment is complete with an internal septum that actually divides that fluid space, separates the excretory organ from the previous segment and the subsequent segment, but the digestive system runs unimpeded down the center. There are no septa in the digestive system. So it's not like the soil that's moving through the digestive system has to stop at a gate for each segment. The digestion is continuous, but the fluids of this space, the metabolic wastes and the products produced, are independent from the next segment. Okay.
Is the clitellum something specific to this class?
That is a good question. I don't think I've ever seen it on any other worm that I've looked at, diagram or in person.
Yeah,
So.
And is it, maybe you know this, you have to cut like a certain side of it for it to regenerate? Is that even a thing like that?
So I believe that earthworms can regenerate. I know nothing about their regeneration. Like I don't know. It's unlike planaria, which I know like how you can slice them. I don't know how earthworms regenerate. And I like. The clitellum plays a role in reproduction. It's part of its mucus secretion, but it's not solely for that purpose. It's a good question. More stuff to look up. I need a notepad of all the questions you guys asked that I don't have an answer to. In the same segmented worm group, but in a different class, we have the polychaetes. These guys are mostly marine dwelling, and they tend to form some sort of hiding space, whether that is actually a tube or a tunnel that they live in, or a structure that they build themselves that they can fold into. And so these guys over here are sort of these free-living polychaetes, but they dig a tunnel that they can retreat to and disappear in. And so you find these guys in the marine benthic environment along the substrate, and they dig a tunnel in that marine environment, and then they can retreat there, or they can go out on foraging excursions and hang out. They have this cute little mouth, eat things. I think they're cute. Maybe not. They look like an alien. Okay. But in the same group are these other worms that have a pretty different lifestyle. So these guys are tube building polychaetes. They actually build these tube-like structures, and the fan that's sticking out here is actually their gill surface that they're using for respiration. And they can retreat down into the tube, and the rest of their body is down in that tube. These guys are filter feeders like the Christmas tree worms, which are another polychaete. I think somebody did an organism of the week on Christmas tree worms. They're pretty small. They also can retreat down into a refugia. These guys have sort of a different lifestyle than the segmented worm, than the oligochaetes. Some of the oligochaetes actually live in water. They tend to be terrestrial or freshwater. These guys tend to be more marine water livers. Okay. Then we're going to move to the next superphylum, the superphylum Ecdyzoa. And I was reorganizing my slides for this class, and I realized that I messed up because as your textbook is organized, our Ecdyzoa really includes both all of the arthropods as well as the nematodes that we already talked about. And so nematodes really belong in this group, but I always like to put them in the worms, and then they have pseudocoelms before we get to coelms, and so I like where I talked about them better, but they go in this group taxonomically. So the Ecdyzoa, just like our previous groups, are all bilaterally symmetrical, triploblastic, protostomic organisms with a tissue organ grade of complexity. But the thing that makes them stand out is that they possess a cuticle. And that cuticle functions as an exoskeleton. So they can use it as a point of muscle attachment. They can use it to prevent desiccation and dehydration. It provides a sturdy and rigid protective barrier between the organism's body and the outside environment. And it has to undergo shedding in order for the organism to grow. So the cuticle limits body size. An organism sort of reaches its max when it gets to the limits of the cuticle, and in order to keep growing, it has to actually split open the cuticle and crawl out of it and grow a new cuticle. The cuticle is non-living. In many organisms, it is made of chitin. Sometimes it's reinforced with calcium carbonate and other minerals to make it hardened, but it's sort of this external layer that is built as a protective surface between the organism and the outside world. So this is a locust of some sort undergoing the process of leaving its cuticle behind. This is called ecdysis, which is where the ecdyzoa name comes from, something that has to leave its cuticle. When we were talking about the endocrine system being somewhat rare in invertebrates, this process is controlled by an endocrine hormone, the regulation of when to begin this process and to prepare all of the cells. The organism also goes through a period of pretty extensive vulnerability while it molts because it's leaving its hard protective shell that makes it not as tasty behind, and it's crawling out as a soft-bodied morsel that everything wants to eat, and it has to go build that new crunchy coating to protect it again. What is a superphylum?
What did you say about like water?
Oh, it reduces loss, evaporative water loss, right? Because it's a rigid barrier, it is also pretty impenetrable to water loss, so it helps them prevent desiccation. So it's a good move for expanding the places you can live. Like when we talked about nematodes, we said they're really abundant in the soil, right? That can be a very dry environment in many cases. We're going to see this in our arthropods that live in a fully terrestrial environment. And so this is another way to have a fully terrestrial life if you have a good barrier for water loss. Okay, so I threw this back in here so we can just sort of refresh. We were talking about the Lophotrochozoa here, and our nematodes are actually here in Ecdyzoa, and I talked about them over here, and that was bad. So just so you know, this is where they belong taxonomically. I learned them over here, and I still want them to be over here because I like this. I like the progression better, but I don't get to control taxonomy, right? We're not going to talk about most of these other guys here. You can find out about them. Maybe the tardigrades. I should pull up a little section on the tardigrades at some point. They're pretty fascinating. But we're going to focus on as our model representative of the Ecdyzoa, the arthropods. Okay. So I have these notices because somebody left the classroom during the parasites. I'm sorry. I guess I should have a warning. I'm going to talk about parasitic organisms now. Some people are really creeped out by parasites. I just have a little like spiders coming, leeches coming, heads up. So this is your warning. There's leeches in the next slide. And leeches are in the wrong place. These were supposed to be part of the segmented worms. What happened? Oh, yes, this is segmented worms. I was wondering why I didn't have more segmented worms. I relocated my slides. I'm so sorry. Leeches were back there as part of our segmented worms. So it's oligochaetes, polychaetes, and then the leeches, the Hirundinia. So, sorry. Right. Clearly my reorganizing of slides didn't go very well. I'd like to mention leeches as being different than our other segmented worms. They have a very different lifestyle. So most of our other segmented worms are filter feeders or are detritivores, decomposing soil. These guys, the leeches, are either blood parasites or predators. And we forget, I think in general, we think of leeches and we just think blood parasites. Like we only think of them as like attaching and sucking blood. There's a whole bunch of leeches who eat microcrustaceans. And so they cruise around on the substrate in rivers and they slurp up little scuds and amphipods and other crustaceans. And so they're not all parasitic, although that's how we tend to think about them. The leeches have a really interesting feeding process. Those that are blood parasites do not need to eat very often. They eat like a tick to engorgement, and then they drop off, and then they go like roll around on the substrate and digest for a long time before they become active again. Once they're full, they take a very long time to digest their blood meal, and so they don't actually feed that frequently, and one meal can sustain them for a long time. When they attach to something that they're going to feed on, they make a very stylistic cut. I don't know if you can see in here, this is a leech cut in some tissue. Their mouth parts cut a three-pronged incision, and then they pump into that incision an anticoagulant. So they actually cause you to bleed more freely so that they can feed faster. So that they have a chance of getting a full meal before they get knocked loose or dislodged. They have a bit of a suction apparatus on the feeding end that holds them in place while they feed, and then they drop off when their stomach is full. So blood flows in, and then when they're full, they drop off. There's some thought that they're actually able to produce a solution that reduces pain. Why can I not think of the word of that? An analgesic. On the surface, but nobody has been able to isolate that substance, and so we're not sure if that's true or not. But they do seem to often be able to feed without you noticing that they're feeding when they first get started. So they may be a little bit sneaky about getting attached. These guys have been used historically a lot in medicine, mostly not necessarily with any actual benefit, but there are some cases where they actually are really important in medicine. They can reduce bruising if they're put on immediately after impact. They can actually help pull up the loose blood that is caused by the impact and prevent the bruise formation. And they use them in limb reattachment. And so because they produce an anticoagulant and increase blood flow to the site, if you cut off a finger and you stitch the finger back on and put a leech on the end of it, they can actually help stimulate the reconnection of the vascularization and get the blood flow out to that tip so that it starts to flow again. So they're actually used in modern medicine in very specific applications. Trey, did you have a question? You look like you did for a minute there. I don't know. Like, I just feel like I'm gonna go. Like, I don't know. Does anybody know of any leech-borne diseases? I've never heard of one. Like, that's not something that I like. Not something I've heard of. Okay, so that one belonged in segmented worms. Sorry. Now we're actually in Ecdyzoa, the arthropods. And so superphylum Ecdyzoa includes the nematodes, which you already talked about in the last lecture, and then it includes the arthropods, which we're talking about in this lecture. So I've just completely messed up Ecdyzoa. Should have just left it out. Arthropods are really cool. It's a huge phylum. And in fact, Ecdyzoa is one of the most diverse and most abundant phyla out there because the nematodes are hugely diverse and hugely abundant and found all around the planet. And arthropods are also extremely prolific. Many, many, many species live in all sorts of habitats and then add flight so they can actually access upper canopies and sites that many of the nematodes can't. And so between those two, the Ecdyzoa phylum is really, really huge and diverse. The term refers to joint foot. These are the joint-footed organisms. So everything that we're going to look at is going to have segmentation and jointing in the limbs. All of our arthropods have bilateral symmetry, coelomate body cavity, presence of a head, cephalization, complete digestive tract, segmentation, which doesn't look like it does in the annelids, but they still have segmented body regions. And then one of the hallmarks of our arthropods is they have really well-developed sensory systems. So we saw in mollusks that they had, vision and pretty developed sensory systems. Arthropods take that to a whole new level. They have amazing chemosensory, really good vision, lots of tactile perception, and so they have sensation. I'm saying that under organ systems. They have lots of sensory systems. Okay. So in some ways, if you look at those two breakdowns, like what does an annelid have versus what does an arthropod have, they're pretty similar, but arthropods have some things that are unique that we don't find in our segmented worms. And so the first of those is jointed appendages. And really, other than the muscular foot that we talked about in the mollusks, we haven't seen much with appendages yet in the invertebrate world. Most things sort of a smooth outer body, maybe some bristles, but not really actual appendages that we think of as limbs. In the arthropods, we have jointed appendages. The joints mean that they flex around that joint. So not only are they like a bristle sticking out from the body, but they're something that can bend and move, right? They lack intersegmental septa. So when we're talking about the annelid worms having a septa between each segment, so like each ring in our segmented worm corresponds to an internal division. That's not true in the arthropods. They have larger spaces, although they still have some of that repetitive body system structure. They just don't have internal septa. They instead have 3 specialized segments instead of many, many, many repeating units. Okay. And then they have this hard exoskeleton. And the exoskeleton opens up whole new worlds, right? It provides protection from desiccation. It gives you a surface to attach muscles to, so you can have more complex movements. It makes you less vulnerable to predators and things that might want to eat you in some cases. Like the exoskeleton does a lot of things. And then they're different in that they kind of go back in our efficiency in that they have an open circulatory system. So our segmented worms had a closed circulatory system. Arthropods have an open circulatory system. Okay. I like to think of arthropods as kind of ruling the world. They are some of the most diverse, most numerous organisms like on the planet. And just one subgroup of arthropods, the insects, really like take the cake on that. But they have a lot of things that give them benefits beyond some of the organisms that we've seen that allow them to live in more diverse habitats, to be found throughout more of the ecosystems of the planet, to be able to be fully terrestrial and not have any association with water. So they have this versatile exoskeleton that we already talked about. They have segmentation and appendages that give them more efficient locomotion. So they're able to move further, faster, cover more ground than some of our other organisms. They have really highly developed sensory organs, so they interact with each other and with their environment in a way that is novel so far in our invertebrates. They're able to sense chemicals, they're able to take in tactile signals, they are able to see, they have all sorts of sensory perception going on. They have some of the most complex behavior patterns of our invertebrates. We talked about learning and intelligence in the cephalopods, right? The octopi and the squid. We take that to a whole nother level. We have really highly structured social systems. Some of the first animal social systems were discovered and described in our arthropods. They have an ability to limit intraspecific competition. Can anybody break this down for me? What does intraspecific mean? With who? What does intraspecific mean? Within their own species. So they reduce same species competition. And then as Alejandro said, they don't compete, they don't use the same resources within the same species. And they accomplish this through metamorphosis. So if you think about a caterpillar and a butterfly, those are members of the same species. The caterpillar is munching leaves and the butterfly is drinking nectar. So by not using the same food resource, parent and offspring are not competing with each other for food, and they can reach higher abundances in the same space. And so one of the things that we see with arthropods is there are just so many of them. Like so many of them. They can be hugely abundant in a small amount of space. And one of the ways that they navigate that is by reducing interspecific competition. And they're able to utilize different habitats. They are also able to take on things like flight and have high metabolism and good ATP production despite their simple bodies because of things like the tracheal system that allow them to pump in air. Not everybody has this in arthropods, but some of them do. And that kind of goes along with the fact that some arthropods, the insects, have the ability to fly. And so that allows them to experience new habitats, go to new places, travel more freely, disperse further distances, all of those things. Okay. So I keep mentioning this exoskeleton. I want to talk a little bit more specifically about the exoskeleton and ecdysis. So the exoskeleton is hardened. It's non-living. It was originally cellular, and then those cells, just like a callus on your hand that gets filled in and becomes a non-living lump, right? That those outer cells are filled in with something like chitin, or in some cases minerals, like calcium carbonate, and becomes a hard surface. And that hard surface gives us an attachment point for muscles. So I can move my arms because I have muscles attached to my internal skeleton, right? A crab or a lobster or an insect can move its body because it attaches muscles to its outer surface. Okay? So they don't have an internal frame, but they use this exoskeleton as an external frame that they can attach things to. It prevents desiccation, so we can have a really terrestrial life, even an aerial life. And then the downside, the negative thing about the exoskeleton is that it has to be shed. So you can't get larger unless you shed your exoskeleton. And you can be very vulnerable during the period that you are shedding your old exoskeleton and building the new one, applying the minerals or the chitin to harden out your new outer surface. I feel like I've talked about this before I got to this slide. Do you guys have any questions about that? Oh, we're going to come back and talk about that. The cephalothorax is the head and thorax together. In some organisms, the head and the thorax are separate. In Things like lobsters, they're fused, and you don't have jointing between the head and the thorax. Instead, you have jointing between the thorax and the abdomen. Oh, another locust. Use the same organism. Such a good way to demonstrate like this crunchy outer protective coating and then this like delicate tasty morsel. Oh, you just find the skeletons behind. Yeah. Yeah. There's like that kind of magic window to catch those guys. So this process of molting is really, it happens in the exact same way on the organism every time they do it. Some organisms may molt tons of times before they ever even get around to undergoing metamorphosis. We're going to talk about organisms that undergo metamorphosis. You guys looked at mealworms in the invertebrate lab, right? I don't even know how many instars there are of mealworms, but there's dozens. So each individual worm, from the point that it hatches from an egg to the point that it pupates, will have to go through this process dozens of times before it gets there. Every time it reaches its maximum cuticle body size, it's got to shed that and get a new exoskeleton, right? In some organisms, they only do it a few times in their lifetime. It totally depends on how much growth occurs between when the first hardened exoskeleton is built and when you reach your adult maximum body size, or if you actually ever reach an adult maximum body size. In something like a lobster, the lobster actually splits between the cephalothorax and the abdomen is where the exoskeleton first cracks open. And so then the lobster is going to pull its claws and its head out of the old carapace, and then it's going to free its tail last. The locust here splits down the back. That whole center section splits open. And again, it pulls the head and the forelimbs out first, and then crawls the tail. And so you can find these leftover skeletons left behind. If a reptile, like imagine a lizard, eats this locust, most of this comes out in the undigested fecal material. The exoskeleton is just waste. It's really hard to digest. Okay. So arthropods have specialized segmentation. Instead of having just lots of identically repetitive segments, they have what we've frequently referred to as tegmata. That's the official term. And each of these units is one of the tegmata. So the head is one specialized segment, and that's going to be where the feeding and sensory structures are found. And so some organisms, that's easier to identify readily than others, but the head has the sensory and feeding structures. The thorax is the middle structure, and so here on our grasshopper, the thorax is right here, and the thorax is where locomotion happens. So this is where wings attach, and this is where legs attach. So all of the legs will be attached to the thorax. If they're attached to the head, they're not legs, they're antennae or sensory structures, right? Then the abdomen is where the digestive structures are housed. So the digestive structures are obviously underneath in the abdomen. The abdomen tends to be the soft, vulnerable part of the body if it has one. Often the outer surface, the top, the dorsal surface will be more hardened, and the tender underbelly of the abdomen will be softer. When we were talking about tracheal pumping in like grasshoppers and bees and wasps, they have to have a soft abdomen in order to do that motion. If they have had an abdomen that was as rigid as what we find in something like a lobster, they couldn't do that motion. And so you tend to find in the grasshopper, the head and the thorax are actually more fully reinforced and are harder and have more chitin in them, and the abdomen is softer because it then is more flexible. Okay. Oh, and I was going to mention here, again, although Peter already asked this, in things like lobsters and crayfish, the head and thorax actually fuse together, and that's what, so then we talk about the cephalothorax versus the abdomen. But if you look, you can still see where the segmentation is. It's just that that kind of creates one large shield. And still here, this is the most delicate part of our lobster, right? Where that tail is able to move, more flexibility. Okay, spiders. Is the person who was really upset about spiders here? I don't think so. Anyway, spiders next. So there'll be some spider pictures. I have to admit that I love spiders, so I may go a little heavy on the spider pictures. I think they're cute. I know that makes me creepy. But this is subphylum Chelicerata, and the Chelicerata are all organisms that have chelicerae, which are these mouth parts that can be used either to feed or they can be used as sensory structures or weapons. And in some cases, they're very important in sexual behavior. And so they can actually be colorful or modified. Peacock spiders, if you ever see the videos, peacock spiders they're waving their pedipalps, they're colorful, and they're like, hey ladies, I have pretty pedipalps, right? They're a secondary sex characteristic. So Chelicerata don't have antennae. They're a little bit more earlier evolved than the other arthropods. Some of them are practically living fossils. So horseshoe crabs are very ancient chelicerates, right? They have probably not evolved in a very, very long time. Whereas some of our other things that we interact with more oftenly, like dust mites or spiders or scorpions, have changed from their ancestral past a little bit more. These are the major groups of chelicerates: scorpions, spiders, ticks and mites, and then the horseshoe crabs. You guys have this? I'm just writing you're either sleeping or writing very diligently today. It's like one or the other, I think. Well, some of you never write, and so you're paying attention. Oh yeah, there we go. My favorite spider. So this peacock spider, I mean, come on, how cute is he? The only way we could make him cuter is if we put like a little dewdrop on his head, like a hat. You've seen those pictures? So cute. So these are the pedipalps here. And in this case, they're used as mating structures and they're brightly colored for as a secondary sex characteristic. Visually stimulating. Okay, there we go. I'm a sucker for little spiders. I love jumping spiders. That's who used to live in my nightlight, a jumping spider. I don't know where he went. Probably outlived his lifespan. Wolf spiders give me pause, but I've come to terms with them. Like wolf spiders coming out and like encountering them unexpectedly, well, I have to have a moment. And then I'm like, oh yeah, those guys are cool too. But they're a little creepy at first. Otherwise, I let a black widow live in my garage for years. Like she had her corner. I knew where she was. I don't know. They don't bother me. So one class of chelicerates are the arachnids, arachnida, right? All of the arachnids have 8 walking legs. So you can tell an arachnid by its legs. They are all either carnivorous or parasitic, and most of them consume a liquid diet. So our jumping spider up here, our tarantula down here, our orb weaver over here, the spiders are going to capture their prey, often subdue them with silk, and then they bite into them with their fangs. And from the tip of their fangs, they actually exude some digestive juices. And those digestive enzymes begin to decompose the prey item from the inside. And then they drink the fluid back. And so they don't actually munch, eat something. They ingest its internal contents. By doing that, they can leave behind the exoskeleton. So they don't even have to deal with like casting off all of that hard material from their prey item. And they just, some of them, like the fishing spiders that eat fishes, just leave the bones behind, leave the scales behind. They just ingest the nutrient juices. Okay, so the digestion gets started externally, and once the prey has been liquefied, they drink the juices. So if you have, I had a house where I had carpenter ants, and the spiders ate them all the time, but they left little ant burritos, the leftover exoskeletons everywhere. I let those guys live in my house too. Scorpions subdue their prey with a sting, right? They immobilize their prey and consume them. Ticks drink a liquid diet, but their liquid diet is different. They don't use a digestive enzyme to liquefy their prey. Instead, they drink the blood of their prey. Mites tend to be a little bit more, like they can actually eat dead skin cells and small blood meals as well. Yeah. Oh. But there's like spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites. Mites tend to be really tiny. They're not completely, like, you can see them, but you can't make out their details with the naked eye. They're really tiny. Yeah. And they're often red or brown. They tend to kind of stand out. Their color is usually striking against. You can see a mite on an animal if you have an animal in your hand. Even in its fur, you can often see the red mite.
So like in the summertime, sometimes there's like tiny bright red cowboy spiders or mites.
Probably.
They're like on.
You have to ask them if they have 8 legs. I can't identify something that you saw last summer from that description, but they may be mites. Huh? Really, really tiny and bright red is a pretty good mite description. Huh? Yeah.
I think we all know.
Yeah. I mean, like, to confirm, you could make sure that they have 8 walking legs. And Chelicera. Okay. Then our next subphylum is the Myriapoda. And Myriapoda really contain 2 main groups, centipedes and millipedes, right? What happened to my slide there? This should say. So these guys are mostly terrestrial. So are most of the arachnids, but not all of them. And they have 1 pair of appendages per segment. And if you look carefully at a millipede, like this guy here, this millipede is pretty similar to the one we had in our class. When you look at them, it appears that they have 2 pairs of legs per segment, and that's because each one of their external segments is actually a fusion of 2 segments that are internal. So when you look at them, it looks like they have 2 pairs of legs per segment, but it's actually that each segment is 2 internal segments. So that can be kind of confusing. Centipedes don't have hundreds of legs. Millipedes don't have thousands of legs. They have many fewer legs than they are named after, but they do have many, many, many legs. This is sort of the most common centipede. I think it's called the house centipede. Like, they're in your basement, right? They're always in your basement. You find them scuttling around. They're usually in the dark underneath something, but every now and then they come out. Those are pretty common that you might encounter in your household. This is a non-native species. This is a tropical species. You're not ever going to encounter it. I think they're pretty. They're really brightly colored. They're telling you that they're dangerous. I don't know. Lots of things get 2 feet long. So, but we do find lots of centipedes that have similar coloration and similar shape under our logs and in our forest. All right, guys, you're making me crazy. Can you go have your conversation in the hall? Like, you don't have to be here, right? Okay. So centipedes are more dangerous. They tend to be more creepy. Some of them are actually dangerous to humans. They're fast and they're carnivorous. So they're going to hunt down prey and eat that prey, right? Millipedes are gentle, right? Some of them have emit toxins if you bite into them, but they are not predators. And so people tend to be a little bit afraid of millipedes as well. But these guys are just herbivores. Most of them are actually detritivores. They just want to eat decomposing stuff. Like, they're pretty chill. They're slower moving. When they move their legs move like in an undulating wave, if you saw them. So they're never going to go scuttling across your basement super fast like the centipedes do. So when you see them from a distance, fewer legs, faster moving, and predatory, a centipede. More legs, slower moving, herbivore as a millipede. Tons of species of both of these, right? From itty bitty, barely can see them, up to several feet long. Even some of the millipedes can be really quite giant. But it all, like, everything's bigger in the tropics, right? So we don't have to deal with giant centipedes or giant millipedes here in North America. Whoops. Okay. Our last subphylum in this group are the Crustacea. And Crustacea are predominantly aquatic. And they include some things you might not think of being in here. All of the crustaceans have 2 pairs of antennae and a calcium carbonate carapace. So what that means, oops, calcium carbonate, this is mineralized. So it's not just a crunchy, hard outer exoskeleton. It's an exoskeleton that's like bone, right? It's really hard. So they take their exoskeleton and they reinforce it with mineral deposition and make their outer skeleton much, much, much firmer. Okay. So the crustacea include crabs, shrimp, lobsters, barnacles. Those guys up there maybe don't have the same physical exterior appearance that you think of, but they have 2 pairs of antennae and they create the calcium carbonate carapace. They just have the ability to retract their body into it. So barnacles are filter feeders. They have a much different physical appearance than crabs and shrimp, which are pretty similar. Also in this group, though, are all the microcrustaceans that we looked at in our first invertebrate lab. So the aquatic isopods, the little amphipods and the scuds, the daphnia, the ostracods, all of those things are in this group. So 2 pairs of antennae and some calcium carbonate carapace. The microcrustaceans tend to be much less reinforced, but the larger ones are very reinforced. If any of you have ever tried to eat a lobster claw or a crab leg, you know how hard it is to get into the interior. That's because of all that mineral exoskeleton, right? I don't like to eat from the ocean in general, but if you order crabs, they usually give you like a plier and a hammer type thing, right? Because you've got to really work to break them open. Or if you're a seagull, you pick them up you fly them really high and you drop them on a rock to break them open, right? You have to have some mechanism of getting through that carapace if you're going to eat these guys. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is a whole class of organisms that is really, really large and really, really diverse, and that's class Insecta. So if you look at all of the organisms from the animal-like protozoans, all of the invertebrates, all of the vertebrates as one big pie, right? Chordates and vertebrates are over here in this slice. Protozoans are in this slice. All of the non-anthropod invertebrates, so everything we've talked about up until anthropoda, is here. The other arthropods, like the chelicerates and our crustaceans, are there. More than half of the pie is insects, right? By number of species, by number of individuals in populations, and actually, shockingly, by biomass, dominant creatures on Earth. Right? They are everywhere. They are small, but they are numerous and mighty. And so insects are really just one of those things we overlook all the time. We think of them as things that we might want to swat or step on, but we don't give them their full value in our global ecosystem. They're hugely, hugely important in our global ecosystem, and they're very, very diverse and have a lot of features that have allowed them to kind of just take over the world. They're found everywhere, right? They're resistant to desiccation, so they can have a fully terrestrial and aerial life. They have important mechanisms to conserve water, those Malpighian tubules we talked about. They have the tracheal system of gas exchange, so they can increase their oxygen levels. They're very adaptable. They have social and asocial and eusocial organizations and societies. Some of them have evolved flight, not all of them. They're just really, really diverse. Many of them have metamorphosis also. So we'll go through and look at some of the characteristics of insects. We could take an entire class just on insects and still not cover all of them that we know. I mean, they're just really that diverse. So I feel like this whole invertebrate thing is such an injustice to the diversity of invertebrates. Like my 2 seconds I'm going to talk about insects is really an injustice to how diverse and cool insects are. And you should talk about insects with Justin if you have an opportunity, because it's always fun. You'll learn a lot. Okay. And I don't have Justin here, so I'm not sure I can name all the orders. I made him do this last year in this class. These are some representative organisms of the different orders of insects. So they're like often, when we think about something like caddisflies, there are multiple orders of caddisflies, which just blows my mind. They're so, so, so diverse. So this is just sort of a sampling. We have things like moths and butterflies. We have things like bees and wasps and ants. We have things like dragonflies and damselflies. We have true bugs. We have grasshoppers, leafhoppers, and crickets. We have beetles. And I honestly don't know what this guy is. Cockroach, termite. Termites are like ants, right? Probably cockroaches. I've never lived in a place where I had to experience cockroaches. So those of you from the south and the tropics can talk about cockroaches. Not in the wild. Never seen them natively. No. This is a beetle in flight. And I love this picture because beetles have this really, like, I mean, they've got this hard outer case. And then they have wings that are packed up in some magic origami underneath their hard outer case. So this is what's called the elytra. And that's the hard shell that is the outer surface of the beetle. So when the beetle's walking along, it's got its hard, shiny back, like if you picture a ladybug, right? When it wants to fly, it unfolds its wings from underneath the elytra and flies with them with these like clumsy elytra around on top. So when your house is invaded by ladybugs and it seems like they're very clumsily flying around and stumbling into things, their flight is impeded by their protective layer. I love this picture because it just does a really good job of showing those features. There's an ant down here. Ants are with the wasps and bees in the Hemiptera. They're pretty cool too, so I wanted to add them in. The basic structure that we looked at when we first talked about arthropods is true of all of the insects. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. They don't have the combined cephalothorax. The head and the thorax remain separate, generally speaking. They tend to have a lot of sensory organs. So they have antennae, they have a compound eye, they often have tactile organs on their frontmost forelimbs and or some mouth parts that are tactile. This is showing you the compound eye of a fly. And it's hard to see because this picture isn't really zoomed in, but the eye is made up of thousands of individual sensory pieces. And so what the insects produce as a visual image, they produce an image, but it's not an image like ours. What they actually see is a mosaic. And so if you could think of a mosaic piece of work or mosaic tiling, where each little image is its own component, right? Each one of the receptors in their eye is seeing its own tile. And then they're putting all those tiles together to make an image. And there's the gap between what this tile sees and what this tile sees, just like the mortar in a mosaic. And so they have this mosaic image, our best understanding of what they can see. Right? I've never been inside an ant's eye to ask it, but they probably see this mosaic image instead of a continuous image like we see. So these large compound eyes, which are not homologous but are analogous to ours. Some insects undergo complete metamorphosis. And when they undergo complete metamorphosis, that means they completely change their body shape between their juvenile state and their adult state. So butterfly is a classic example of complete metamorphosis. We start with an egg. The adult lays the egg. The egg hatches into a larva. The larvae usually go on a feeding frenzy. So larvae are very hungry. They need to get to their size in order to metamorphosis. So larvae tend to do a lot of feeding, tend to be herbivorous, generally speaking, not always, but generally. They may have to go through multiple larval instars. So they may have to shed their exoskeleton in order to grow. They may have a less firm or a more firm exoskeleton, depending. If you think about something like a caterpillar larva or a grub, they're pretty soft-bodied, right? They're pretty tasty even when they're not molting from a eater perspective. But they tend to harden up as they get older. At some point, they will find a place to pupate. They will not be able to move while they're pupating. The pupa are really pretty vulnerable in terms that they don't have any control of their lives while they're pupating. They often tend to not be highly sought after as a food source the way the larvae are, because they're all wrapped up in their outer casing and there's a lot of inedible bits, but they are pretty vulnerable. They find a place to hunker down and they begin to go through the metamorphosis process. They essentially liquefy their whole body and rebuild it during this process. But what's really cool is they remember things that they experienced before their body rearranged. And so like the larval brain and the adult brain, it's the same brain. Like they have memory of experiences. They have epigenetic expression that is similar to, or is part of what their parent had. But they completely rearrange the whole body from this morph into this morph. And so the caterpillar that emerges, or the butterfly that emerges, even the core body of the butterfly is not caterpillar-like. Right? The caterpillar doesn't have as distinctly notable head, thorax, and abdomen. Let me do that again. Head, thorax, and abdomen, as the adult does. It has wings, in this case, which have been built especially for flight. Sometimes the adult will never feed. They may not need to eat, they're just going to reproduce and die. Or they may have a feeding mechanism that's completely different than the larva. So this caterpillar is munching on leaves. This adult is now going to go be a nectar drinker. Yes. A beetle. Huh? Yeah. Yeah. You think of a butterfly, a beetle is the first one that comes to my head. Wasps and ants and bees, right? Like a baby bee is just a little white grub, and then it turns into a flying, stinging bee. Yeah, lots of things. Those are the most common examples that are popping into my head. Yeah. That's always my concern about some of those things is what is the non-target species. There's also concern about jumping genes between corn and other species. Like, can we have that happen? Jumping genes, getting into a neighboring species and then having that genetic modification. These guys are really cool. The adults actually contain a toxin that makes them very distasteful and will make a bird vomit. And that comes from the feeding of the larvae. So the larvae eat milkweed. The milkweed has the toxin. The larvae are toxic. They build up that toxin in their body, and when they reconfigure, the adult retains that, even though the adult doesn't actually ever eat the toxin again. So it's kind of cool. Yeah. Hey, mom. Or hey, adult version. I'll take care of you. I'm like, I was saying that backwards because sometimes that also happens that the parent conveys it to the offspring. That's a whole different story. Did you have a question over here? Okay. It takes some time. I don't know what the sequence is of how things are rearranged. And I'm being a little bit loose with my explanation when I say they liquefy their whole body, but they rearrange their entire body. No, because we've been talking about metamorphosis with lots of other organisms that have larval versions and adult versions, like well, the starfish was the example I gave in animal diversity. We haven't talked about them yet, but we looked at it in all of the things that have the different types of the leucophore larvae or the trichophore larvae, right? Those guys are going to metamorphose from their larval state to their adult state. The hydras have their little planular larvae and then they become a polyp. Yeah, those guys all undergo metamorphosis. It is, for whatever reason, so much a hallmark of insects. And maybe it's because the larvae can often have a very long time period as larvae. Like most of the other species, you're a larvae, kind of like you're an egg and then you're a larvae and then your real life starts. Like those are short phases. Whereas some insects may be larvae they may overwinter as larvae. They may have like long durations as a larvae. And so maybe because they have a really significant role in the ecosystem in their larval version, that's why we think about it so much with insects. I don't know. It's a good question. Okay, some other organisms, like a lot of the true bugs, other insects, undergo incomplete metamorphosis. And so in this case, instead of having a caterpillar-like larva, which most of them, like most of the things that are not caterpillar-like are grub-like, they sort of have a soft body legged larva version. In incomplete metamorphosis, the young are called nymphs, and they're like mini adults. They usually don't have all of the features of the adult, but they're more likely to eat the same food as the adult and not have that complete separation between the larval stage and the adult stage. So this is a cinch bug, and the cinch bug that hatches from the egg, instead of being a little worm-like shape, is like a little mini cinch bug. It's small. That nymph is going to have to go through shedding its exoskeleton and growing. In its early phases, it's just sort of brown and plain. It can hide. As it gets towards the end of its juvenile state, it starts to take on the adult appearance. But in all three of these phases, these young nymphs are unable to fly. But the adult is able to fly. So it's only when they go through their final metamorphosis that are their only metamorphosis, their final exoskeleton change, that they develop their wings and take on their full adult coloration. And now they can reach other habitats, even if they're eating a similar food, they can fly and gather food over further distances. Okay. That's class, right? I wasn't paying attention to the time. Good thing somebody was. Somebody gave me a look, like, all right, it's time to wrap it up. So that's also insects. So we will wrap up this chapter on Thursday and start vertebrates. on Thursday. So vertebrates are on the next exam. This last little section here on echinoderms will be the end of what's on this exam next week. So exam, not this Thursday, but next Thursday. So a little over a week away, okay? I will figure out what's going on with protists, and we'll talk about outlines and research papers a little bit also on Thursday. Maybe some clicker questions. I was going to bring clicker questions today. Let's have some clicker questions on Thursday. Make a list, all the things. Is this somebody's pen or was this here? Did I steal this from somebody? Yeah, that's a pretty nice one. Okay. Thank you guys for suffering through the mega lecture.